The bedroom is cold in the way that Victorian bedrooms are always cold. Not the clean cold of fresh air, but the damp cold of a room that hasn't been properly warmed in years. A cold that lives in the wallpaper and the floorboards and the heavy curtains that are never quite fully drawn. The fire has gone down to ash. The candle on the nightstand throws more shadow than light. She is lying very still. This is not sleep. You know the difference, even from this distance, even across all these years. This is the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is the safest thing she can be. Her breath is even and deliberate. Her hands, folded at her sides, are the hands of someone who has decided that the body she inhabits is not entirely her own, and that there may be no legal remedy for this. She's 23 years old. She was married in the spring when the roses were out and the church smelled of beeswax and everyone told her she looked beautiful. She wore white. She said the words that were required of her. She promised to love, to honour, and to obey. And in doing so, in the eyes of her English law, she surrendered something she had not fully understood she possessed. The word no would cost her nothing to say. It would also change nothing at all. Tonight we are going to sit with that truth for a while, not to make you angry, though you may become angry, not to make you sad, though sadness is entirely appropriate. We are going to sit with it the way history requires us to sit with uncomfortable things, slowly, carefully, without looking away, and try to understand how an entire legal system, an entire culture, an entire civilization could construct a world in which a married woman's body was not her own. This is not a distant story. The law that governed her bedroom governed bedrooms in England and Wales until 1991, until 1993 in some American states. The woman lying very still in this cold Victorian room and the woman lying very still in a 1980s suburban bedroom are, in the eyes of the law that protected them, the same woman. The answer they received when they reached for legal language was the same answer. There was no answer, there was no language, there was no law. Settle in. Let the night come around you. This story moves slowly, the way all important things move slowly, and by the end of it you will know something true about the world, women inherited and the world women. Over the course of 255 years, quietly, persistently, at great personal cost began to dismantle. You are standing outside a church in England. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. Let us say 1857, a year of particular significance, though we will return to that. It is a Saturday. The bells have just finished ringing and the last guests are moving through the lich gate and down the path toward the road. Rice has been scattered, though it is beginning to look like February rain. The bride is already inside a carriage. She is smiling because this is what is required. The groom climbs in beside her. The horses move, and somewhere in the legal architecture of this moment, invisible, unspoken, encoded in a doctrine that is already more than a century old, something is transferred. Not the rice, not the flowers, something more permanent than those. Her consent. Or rather, her consent is declared to have already been given permanently, unconditionally at the moment she said those words at the altar, and it cannot now be withdrawn, not by her, not ever, not for any reason that English law will recognise. The carriage moves down the lane, and this woman, who perhaps had hopes and fears and preferences and self she understood to belong to herself, has entered a legal category that will govern her body for as long as she lives. If you enjoy listening to stories like this one, subscribe. I post stories like this every week. This story begins, as so many of the worst stories begin, with a man who was considered respectable. Sir Matthew Hale was a 17th century judge who sat on the King's Bench and eventually rose to become Lord Chief Justice of England. He was by the standards of his time a serious and educated man. He believed in the law. He wrote about the law. He thought very carefully about what the law meant and what it was for. In 1736, a book called Historia Placitorum Coronae, The History of the Pleas of the Crown, was published posthumously from Hale's papers. It was a textbook, a reference work, the sort of document that judges and lawyers would consult when they needed to understand how the law applied to a given situation. In that book, in a section on sexual assault, Hale wrote the following: A husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. She cannot retract. Those 3 words would sit in the body of English law for the next 255 years. They would be cited by judges. They would be repeated in courtrooms. They would be used to dismiss cases and reject claims and send women home with nothing. They would govern the bodies of every married woman in England and Wales, and through the reach of the British Empire in many other places besides. She cannot retract. Let us sit with that for a moment before we move forward. Let us notice what it means. It means that the law at the moment of marriage treated a woman's body as a thing that had been handed over, not borrowed, not shared, handed over. The transfer was permanent, the transaction was complete at the altar, and from that moment forward the question of what she wanted, tonight, tomorrow, next year, in the cold bedroom at the end of a long marriage, was simply not a legal question. It was not something the law was interested in. It had already been answered, in 1736, by a man who was not her. This is where we begin, in that cold bedroom, with that cold truth, with 255 years of women for whom the word no was a private word, a word that existed in their bodies and their minds and sometimes in their voices, but that had no pathway into the law that was supposed to protect them. To understand what the Victorian woman faced when she said no, it is necessary to understand what she was before she opened her mouth, what she had already become at the moment of marriage, what had already been done to her legal self before any particular wrong was done to her body. The doctrine was called coverture. It came from the old Norman French, couverture, a covering, and it described what happened to a woman's legal identity when she married. She was covered. She was subsumed. She was, in the language of the law, folded into her husband until the 2 of them formed a single legal person, and that single legal person was him. William Blackstone, the great 18th century legal commentator, described it with characteristic confidence. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Suspended, not diminished, not limited, suspended. The word matters. It suggests something temporary, something that might one day be resumed. But the suspension lasted the length of the marriage, and the marriage lasted until death. And in the Victorian era, death was often a long time coming. What did coverture mean in practice? It meant that a married woman could not own property in her own name. Anything she brought to the marriage, her inheritance, her savings, the silver her grandmother left her, the small cottage her father had given her, became upon marriage her husband's, not shared, his. It meant she could not enter into contracts. It meant she could not sue in her own right. It meant that the wages she earned, if she earned wages, belonged to him. It meant, in the most intimate and devastating sense, that her body was not a site of legal protection. Because she had no legal self distinct from her husband, she could not bring a legal claim against him. You cannot sue yourself, and since she was, in law, him, the thing he had done to her was the thing he had done to himself, which was nothing, which was no crime at all. This was not a Victorian invention. Coverture was old. It stretched back through centuries of English common law, through the medieval period, through Norman conquest, through layers of legal tradition that had always assumed, at their foundation, that the natural unit of social organisation was the male-headed household. The woman was part of that household. She was not the head of it. She was not the legal actor within it. She was, in the careful and terrible vocabulary of the law, a dependent. But the Victorians inherited coverture and did something distinctive with it. They wrapped it in sentiment. They covered the legal structure in lace and called it protection. They insisted, with extraordinary sincerity in many cases, that the law's erasure of the married woman was actually a form of honour. She was too delicate for the crude business of contracts and property and legal disputes. She was too pure for the marketplace, too good for the gutter of commerce. The domestic sphere was her kingdom, and the kingdom was beautiful, and what she could not see from within it was that the kingdom had no exits. The Victorian domestic ideal, the angel in the house, as the poet Coventry Patmore called her in his widely read verse, was not simply a set of social expectations. It was a legal architecture. The angel in the house could not leave the house without permission. The angel in the house could not take her children when she left. The angel in the house, if she found herself in that cold bedroom with that cold truth, had no language the law would listen to. Think for a moment about what it meant to be described as too precious for the law's protection. The Victorian argument for coverture was, in its most sincere form, a paternalistic one. It said, "The law is a rough and brutal place, and the woman deserves to be shielded from it." It said, "Let her husband deal with the coarse machinery of courts and contracts. Let her remain in the clean air of the domestic sphere, where her true gifts, her moral influence, her tender management of the home, can flower without the contaminating touch of legal dispute." The argument sounded kind. It was not kind, because what it actually said was, she is too valuable to protect herself, and a person who is too valuable to protect herself is a person who has no protection at all, except what someone else chooses to provide, and what someone else chooses to provide can be withdrawn, or withheld, or used as a lever. Protection that depends on the protected person's goodwill is not protection, it is leverage. There were women who knew this, who understood with great clarity exactly what had been done to them at the altar, who could name the doctrine, cite the precedents, trace the argument back to Hale and before him. These women were not common, but they existed. Some of them wrote about it, some of them organised around it, some of them stood in rooms and said quietly, to whoever would listen, "We have been disappeared by the law that is supposed to protect us, and we would like to return." And some of those women went further. They understood that the erasure of the legal self was not the only thing that had happened to them at the altar. They understood that the declaration of irrevocable consent, Hale's formulation, the wife's perpetual sexual availability, was connected to the property erasure, the contractual disability, the inability to sue. They were all expressions of the same underlying principle. The principle that a married woman was not a legal person, that her interests were not interests the law was required to address, that her body, her property, her children, her earnings, her future, all of this was managed by the husband for the husband's convenience, within a legal structure that had declared her presence unnecessary. This is the full weight of what was carried into the cold Victorian bedroom, not just the specific wrong that might happen there, but the entire context of legal erasure that surrounded it, that made it possible, that ensured it could happen without any legal remedy being available. Those women and their long, patient, costly campaign are part of this story. But we are not there yet. We are still in the early Victorian period, in the cold bedroom, with a woman who has just been told, by the entire weight of English legal tradition, that the question of what she wants is not a question the law is interested in. She turns toward the window. Outside, the street is empty. The gas lamps make their soft, fuzzy rings of light in the dark. A cat crosses the road. Somewhere distant, a clock strikes the hour. She lies very still. The legal structure that had erased her was comprehensive. It touched every corner of her life, but it manifested most immediately, most physically, most personally in this room, in this bed, in the hours between dusk and dawn when a married woman's body was, according to the law of England and Wales, not her own. We need to understand what it felt like to inhabit that legal reality before we can understand what it took to change it. And to understand that, we need to go further into the daily texture of a Victorian marriage, what it looked like from the outside, what it felt like from the inside, and what was available to a woman who found that what had been promised to her and what had been delivered were two very different things. The answer for most of the 19th century was very little, and then, slowly, imperfectly, at enormous cost, a little more. The law would move. It would move in the direction of acknowledging women's existence. But it would move in small steps, on small questions, and the most intimate question of all, the question of what happened in the bedroom, would wait the longest of all. You're a young woman in 1845. You're perhaps 19 or 21, living in a middle-class household in a provincial city, Leeds perhaps, or Bristol, or one of the newer industrial towns that have grown so fast they still have mud where the streets should be. Your father is a solicitor or a mill owner or a successful merchant of some kind. You have been educated, not enormously, but adequately. You can read, and you do read. You play the piano with moderate skill, your French is passable, You have been taught watercolour, embroidery, and the management of a household budget. You have also been taught, though no one has said this aloud in those exact words, that all of this preparation, the music, the French, the watercolours, is not for yourself. It is for the person who will eventually take you from this house and install you in another one. It is preparation for the role that is waiting for you, that has always been waiting for you. That is essentially the only role the world is willing to make available. Marriage. And through marriage, the only form of economic security the 19th century was willing to offer a middle-class woman. This is important to understand, not as a footnote, not as background colour, but as the central organising fact of your existence. You have no profession. There are no professions available to you. Not really. Not in the sense of something that provides income and respectability and a place in the world. You could become a governess, which is to say you could become an educated servant, tolerated rather than welcomed in the households where you work, belonging neither to the family nor to the staff, existing in a social no man's land that Victorian novelists would spend decades documenting, because it was so perfectly terrible. You could take in sewing, or music pupils, or washing. These are the options. Or you could marry. And marriage, when it came with its particular set of unspoken terms. You would move from your father's legal jurisdiction to your husband's. You would exchange one form of dependence for another. The law, as we have seen, would fold you into him. Your property would become his. Your legal identity would be subsumed into his. And your body, this body that you have inhabited for 21 years, that you have learned and inhabited and carried through the world, would be declared, by the permanent and irrevocable fact of matrimonial consent, to be available to him, always, without the possibility of refusal. Did women know this? Did they understand, going into the marriage market, what the legal terms of the transaction were? The answer is complicated, and the complication tells us something important about how systems of power maintain themselves. Some women knew, women with educated fathers, or access to legal documents, or the right kind of reading, might have understood in the abstract that coverture existed. They might have known the word. They might have read Blackstone. But abstract knowledge and lived understanding are different things, and the Victorian cultural machinery, the novels, the sermons, the conduct books, the advice literature, the whole vast apparatus of respectable femininity, was entirely designed to ensure that the emotional understanding of marriage pointed in one direction, while the legal reality pointed in another. The emotional understanding was romantic, or at least sentimental. You were going to a home of your own. You were going to a man who would provide for you. You would have children, and a household, and a purpose. The conduct books, and there were dozens of them, enormously popular, bought and read by middle-class women across the country, described marriage in the language of mutual devotion, shared interest, domestic harmony. They described the wife's role as sacred. They described the home as a sanctuary. They described the relationship between husband and wife as the highest and most ennobling human bond. What they did not describe was what happened if the bond was not ennobling. What happened if the man you married was cruel, or cold, or in the grip of something dark that the daylight hours concealed? What happened if the sanctuary was not safe? What happened in the cold bedroom at night, when the question of what you wanted came up against the permanent legal answer that had already been given on your behalf, without your specific consent, by a dead 17th century judge? The marriage market was very good at not describing this, and Victorian culture was very good at not discussing it. The word that described what could happen to a woman in her own bed had no legal meaning. There was no crime to name. You cannot name something the law does not recognise. But consider the market itself more carefully, because it tells us something about the pressure that brought women into it. The alternative to marriage for a middle-class woman was not independence. It was a different kind of dependence, on her family, on charity, on the mercy of employers who would hire her at wages designed for women, and therefore designed to be inadequate. The single woman of the Victorian era was a social and economic anomaly. She was pitied. She was suspect. She was the subject of a whole set of cultural anxieties about women who had not found husbands, as if the failure were hers. The spinster, that word with all its weight of condescension, was the cultural alternative to the wife. And the spinster's life, as Victorian culture imagined and often arranged it, was a life of service and dependency, and quiet inadequacy. She looked after aging parents. She took in modest employment of a suitable kind. She lived on the margins of other people's households, grateful for the accommodation. Against this alternative, marriage, even marriage with its legal erasures, even marriage with its irrevocable consent, even marriage with its cold bedroom, looked like the better choice. And for many women it was, in the narrow sense that the economic security it offered was real, and the alternative was genuinely worse. The fact that the better choice involved surrendering your legal personhood was simply the cost of the better choice. This is the trap, and it was a deliberately constructed trap. Not deliberately in the sense that men sat down together and designed a system intended to coerce women into marriage. Deliberately in the sense that every element of the system, the lack of professions, the inadequacy of women's wages, the social stigma of the single woman, the absence of any real alternative, functioned together to make marriage the only reasonable option. The trap was built into the architecture of Victorian society, and it was maintained by legal and cultural and economic forces working in concert with extraordinary effectiveness. A woman who walked down the aisle in 1845 was not making a free choice in any meaningful sense. She was choosing between marriage and the various forms of social and economic marginality that awaited her if she did not. The choice was real, in that it was hers to make. But the options were arranged for her by forces she had not chosen and could not control. The marriage market sold something. It sold security and status and a place in the world. What it did not say in its advertising literature was what it cost, and for many women the price was paid privately, in the dark, in a cold room, where the word they said was heard by no one the law was willing to listen to. But there were women who understood, even as they walked down the aisle, that the price was being charged. There were women who had thought carefully about what they were entering into, and who had made calculations about how to manage within it. Women who had negotiated as best they could with the men they were marrying about the terms of the domestic arrangement. Women who had asked for things, more freedom, more money, more consideration, and sometimes received them as personal concessions rather than legal rights. These negotiations were private. They were not enforceable. They depended on the goodwill of the husband and could be withdrawn at any time. But they were real, and they mattered, and they represent the way that women worked with what was available to them, rather than simply enduring what could not be changed. We will return to these strategies of navigation and survival later. For now, let us stay with the cold reality of what the marriage market was and what it sold. And let us notice that the women who entered it did so, very often, with clear eyes and heavy hearts, and the knowledge that the world as it was arranged for them was not the world they might have chosen for themselves. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. 1857 is a year worth pausing on. It is the year the Matrimonial Causes Act came into force in England and Wales, and it is a year that illuminates, with particular clarity, exactly how slowly the legal world was willing to move on the question of what a married woman was entitled to. Before 1857, if you wanted a divorce in England and Wales, if you wanted the marriage legally dissolved, not merely separated but actually ended, you needed an Act of Parliament. This was not a metaphor. You needed to petition Parliament directly, to have your case heard and your divorce granted by legislative action. The process was expensive beyond the reach of almost everyone, and it had been used between 1700 and 1857 by approximately 325 people. 325 divorces in 157 years. For all the millions of marriages that occurred in that period, for all the cold bedrooms and the careful silences and the coded letters, 325 people found the legal structure passable enough, and affordable enough, and survivable enough to move through it. Only 4 of those were women. Let that settle. 321 men and 4 women, not because women had fewer unhappy marriages, not because women had fewer reasons to want out, but because the divorce procedure, in addition to its extraordinary cost, had an additional requirement. The petitioner needed to prove that the other party had committed a matrimonial offence. For a man, this was not difficult. Adultery was sufficient. If a wife had been unfaithful, a husband could seek a parliamentary divorce on that ground. For a woman, adultery alone was not enough. She had to prove aggravated adultery. Adultery combined with some additional offence such as bigamy, incest, cruelty, or desertion. Simple adultery by the husband, without any additional injury, was not grounds enough for a woman to escape the marriage. The logic of this asymmetry was stated openly by those who defended it. A wife's infidelity was a more serious matter than a husband's, because it introduced doubt about the paternity of children, and thus threatened the inheritance of property. A husband's infidelity, however wounding to the wife, introduced no comparable legal confusion. Therefore, the law treated them differently. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 established the divorce court and made civil divorce possible without parliamentary action. This was, for its time, a significant change. It made divorce accessible, at least in theory, to a much larger number of people, but it did not remove the asymmetry. A husband could still obtain a divorce on the grounds of adultery alone. A wife still had to prove something more. The debates around the 1857 Act are worth reading, if you have the patience for Victorian parliamentary language and the particular cadence of men explaining to other men why women required special consideration. The arguments in favour of the asymmetry were made with perfect sincerity by men who believed them entirely. There was no cruelty intended, or at least none acknowledged. There was simply the assumption, as old as the common law itself, that the interests of women in marriage were a secondary consideration, and that the primary structure of that institution was designed around male property rights and male social concerns. The debates also reveal something about how the Victorian political class thought about the private sphere. Marriage, several speakers argued, was a sacred institution. It was a religious institution, protected by the church, governed by principles that were not simply legal, but moral and divine. Introducing a secular divorce court was already a radical departure from tradition. To go further, to begin questioning the internal arrangements of the marriage, to suggest that what happened inside the institution was a proper subject for legal remedy beyond the question of separation, would be to invite the collapse of the domestic order on which all of society depended. This argument that the domestic sphere was too sacred, too fundamental to be subjected to legal scrutiny, would recur throughout the history we are tracing. It would be made by men in Parliament, by judges on the bench, by clergymen in their pulpits, by newspaper editorialists defending the sanctity of the home. Every time a reformer attempted to extend the law's reach into what happened inside a marriage, they encountered this argument. You cannot go there. That is private. That is sacred. The law has no business in the bedroom. The reformers had a response to this argument, though it took time to develop it fully. The response was, the privacy of the bedroom is protecting the wrong people. You're declaring the bedroom private on behalf of the person who holds power there. The person without power, the wife, the dependent, the woman who has been declared legally non-existent, receives no protection from this privacy. She is merely invisible within it. The bedroom is private for him. For her, it is simply a room with no exit. This response was not made in 1857 in those exact words. It would be made in various forms over the next 100 years. But the logic of it was already visible to women who were paying attention. Caroline Norton could see it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton across the Atlantic could see it. The women who gathered in drawing rooms and debating societies and the emerging women's organisations of the mid-Victorian era could see it. The privacy of the marital sphere was not neutral. It was political. It was a political choice, maintained by political actors, in the service of political interests. And the interests it served were not women's. What did Victorian women make of the 1857 Act? The responses were varied, and the variation is instructive. Some women's advocates welcomed it as a step forward, imperfect, but forward. It created legal machinery where before there had been almost none. It acknowledged that some marriages were broken in ways that required legal remedy. That was something. Other women looked at the asymmetry and named it clearly. Caroline Norton, who had spent years campaigning for reform after her own brutal experience of the legal system, a system that had allowed her estranged husband to keep her children and take her literary earnings, wrote about the 1857 Act with the particular clarity of someone who had been personally educated by the law's indifference to women. She was glad of the court. She was not fooled about what it meant. Norton is worth dwelling on for a moment, because her story illustrates, in concentrated form, what the pre-1857 legal landscape looked like for a woman in a bad marriage. She had married George Norton in 1827. He was violent. He beat her. He eventually separated from her and barred her from seeing her children. Children who were, under the law, entirely his. When she began earning money from her writing, he attempted to claim it. When she sought access to her children, he denied it. When she appealed to the legal system for help, the legal system reminded her that she did not exist within it as an independent person. She responded by writing. She wrote pamphlets, she wrote letters, she wrote to politicians. She wrote about the cruelty of the law's position with a directness that was, for the time, remarkable. She named what was happening. She described a system in which a woman had no legal recourse against even the worst treatment by a husband, and she insisted that this was not natural, not inevitable, not ordained by God or nature, but a choice, a legal choice, a political choice, a choice that Parliament could unmake if it chose to. Norton was not a radical. She was careful to position herself as someone who accepted the broad structure of marriage and only wanted protection within it. She said, explicitly, that she was not asking for equal rights. She was asking for minimal protection. She was asking for women to be acknowledged as existing within the legal system in some form, even a diminished one. This is a pattern we will see again and again in the story of Victorian women's legal reform. The ask is always smaller than the problem. The demand is always framed in the most modest possible terms. Because the women who were making the arguments understood with painful clarity that asking for too much would lose everything, and that the tolerance for women's legal claims was precisely calibrated to what men were willing to give. The 1857 Act gave something. It gave a court. It gave a process. It gave a slightly more accessible route to a legal remedy for a broken marriage. What it did not give, what it would not give for more than another century, was any legal recognition of what could happen to a married woman in her own bedroom. The divorce court could end a marriage. It could not reach into the dark to name what had happened there. The cold bedroom remained cold. The legal silence remained complete. And somewhere in England, in 1857, a woman is folding her hands on the coverlet and listening to the clock strike the hour, and understanding that whatever is happening to her is happening in a space the law does not enter. She will find her own accommodations with this. Women always have. But the accommodations are private, and private accommodations are not the same as justice, and justice is what is owed to her, and will not arrive for a very long time. There was another way the Victorian era constructed its understanding of married women's bodies, and it came not from the law but from medicine. The two systems were not separate. They spoke to each other constantly. They reinforced each other. They built between them a comprehensive account of what women were biologically, medically, legally, that made the legal silence around marital violation feel, to those within those systems, not like an oversight but like a reflection of natural truth. Victorian medicine had very particular ideas about women's bodies. Some of these ideas were ancient, inherited from centuries of medical tradition that treated the female body as a variation on the male, inferior by design, prone to instability, governed by forces that required management. Some of these ideas were new, produced by the centuries' enthusiasm for scientific explanation, dressed in the language of biology and physiology and nervous science. The result was a medical literature that described women as fundamentally different from men in ways that bore directly on their legal position. Women were more emotional, more volatile, more subject to the disturbances of the reproductive system. The uterus, Victorian medical writers were deeply preoccupied with the uterus, was understood to exert an influence over the entire female nervous system. Disorders of the reproductive organs could produce mental instability. Mental instability could produce disorders of the reproductive organs. The body and the mind were connected in women in ways that they were not in men, and this connection was a source of fragility. The diagnosis of hysteria is the most well-known expression of this thinking, and it is worth spending a moment with it because it reveals the medical framework's relationship to women's agency very clearly. Hysteria, a diagnosis applied almost exclusively to women, named for the Greek word for uterus, was understood as a disorder of the female nervous system, often triggered by emotional excess. Its symptoms were protean and convenient. It could produce paralysis, tremors, fainting, uncontrolled weeping, emotional volatility, or any number of other manifestations. Its treatment was rest, removal from excitation, and management by a qualified physician. What did this have to do with the cold bedroom? A great deal. Because if a woman's judgment was understood to be less reliable than a man's, more emotional, more subject to the passions, more easily disturbed, then the question of what she wanted was a question that required interpretation. Her no might be nervousness, her resistance might be medical rather than meaningful. Her distress, if she expressed distress, might be a symptom of the very instability that made her require management rather than a response to something actually happening to her. This was not always said openly. In polite medical literature and certainly in polite social discourse, it was framed in the language of protection. Women were protected from the burden of making certain kinds of decisions. Their desires were understood through the lens of what was good for them medically, reproductively, in terms of their nervous health. The decision about what constituted good was made by their doctors and their husbands and the legal system that subsumed them. There were Victorian doctors who were genuinely concerned with women's well-being. There were physicians who listened to their female patients and took what they said seriously. But even the most sympathetic medical practitioner was operating within a framework that made women's self-report less authoritative than male interpretation of that self-report, and that framework extended directly into the bedroom. Let us be specific for a moment about what this meant. If a married woman went to a doctor in the 1860s or 1870s and attempted to describe what was happening to her in her marriage, what was being done to her body without her consent, there was no medical category available for what she was describing. The law had said it was not a crime. Medicine had said that women's desires in such matters were unreliable. The cultural framework had said that the marital bedroom was private, sacred, beyond the reach of outside inquiry. The physician who listened carefully to such a woman faced a choice. He could take her seriously, could acknowledge that she was describing something real, something harmful, something that deserved response. But responding would require him to go outside the boundaries of his professional role as he understood it. He would be required to intervene in a marriage. He would be required to challenge the husband's authority. He would be required to treat the wife as an autonomous person whose account of her own experience was authoritative. All of this was possible for an exceptionally principled or exceptionally thoughtful doctor. None of it was supported by the professional or legal framework within which he was working. More commonly, the doctor could sympathize. He could suggest remedies for nervous exhaustion. He could advise rest or fresh air or a change of scene. He could speak to her husband, if her husband were willing to hear it, about the importance of the wife's health. He could not name what was happening because there was no name. He could not refer the matter to the law because the law had declared the matter outside its jurisdiction. He could offer comfort in the Victorian manner, which was to say he could offer very little. Some women found ways to use the medical system as a form of protection. A persistent ailment, a doctor's advice about the wife's health requiring separate sleeping arrangements. These were the kinds of negotiations that could sometimes provide breathing room in a marriage that was difficult. They required a husband willing to defer to medical authority, and they required the right kind of doctor, and they were entirely dependent on the goodwill of men rather than on any legal right. The medical literature of the period also grappled, in its careful way, with the question of women's sexual feelings and experiences. Victorian medical writers were generally not straightforwardly hostile to the idea that women had sexual feelings. There was a range of opinion. But the dominant framework treated women's sexuality as fundamentally passive and responsive. Women responded to male desire, rather than initiating or directing it. The idea that a woman might have preferences, that those preferences might sometimes be in the negative, that the expression of those preferences in the negative was meaningful and deserved to be honoured. This was not well accommodated by the dominant framework. There were dissenters. There were Victorian and Edwardian doctors who wrote about women's sexual experience with more nuance and more respect. But the dissenters were working against the current of their profession, and the current was strong, and the current ran in the direction of interpreting women's experience through a framework that made their testimony subordinate to male interpretation. What happened to the women who had no sympathetic doctor, or whose husband did not defer to medical authority, or who lived in circumstances too constrained for these kinds of negotiations? What happened to working-class women, for whom the luxury of medical consultation and private accommodations was simply unavailable? What happened in the cold terraced houses of industrial cities, where the bedrooms were not separate and the husbands were not sympathetic, and the doctors were not consulted? It happened in the dark. It happened without a name. It happened to millions of women over the course of the Victorian era and beyond. and the law that was supposed to protect them had looked at the situation and decided that there was nothing to protect against. The husband had done nothing wrong. The wife had given her irrevocable consent. The transaction had been completed. There was nothing here for the law. The medical literature, meanwhile, continued to develop its understanding of the female nervous system. It continued to refine its account of what women were and what they needed and what their bodies meant. And as the century progressed, as the women who were thinking about these things began to think more publicly and more insistently, the medical literature became one of the battlegrounds on which the argument was fought. Because if you could challenge the medical account of women's unreliability, if you could argue that women's self-report was as trustworthy as men's interpretation of it, then you began to have leverage on the legal question. If what a woman said about what was happening to her body deserved to be taken seriously as evidence, then the courtroom became a different place. If no was a meaningful word in the mouth of a woman, rather than a symptom to be managed, then everything downstream of that changes. This is where the reformers would eventually concentrate their energy. But we are not there yet. We are still in the high Victorian period, in the world that the medical literature and the legal doctrine built together, where a woman's body was managed by systems she could not control, in the service of purposes she had not entirely chosen. The fire in the grate is very low, the candle is guttering, the cold is absolute. Somewhere in the 1860s, a movement begins to articulate something that has always been true but has never been said clearly enough to force anyone to listen. The first wave of what would come to be called feminist activism in Britain is usually dated to the campaign for women's suffrage, the vote, the long, slow battle for the vote that would finally be partially won in 1918 and completed in 1928. But the suffrage campaign, as important as it was not where the question of women's bodily autonomy first surfaced publicly. That happened earlier, and in a different register, and in language that was far more explicit about the connection between legal erasure and physical violation. Frances Power Cobb wrote about it. Cobby was a remarkable woman, Irish-born, independently minded, a journalist and social reformer with the particular capacity to see clearly what other people preferred not to see at all. In 1878, she published an essay called Wife Torture in England. It was not subtle in its title, and it was not subtle in its content. The essay documented domestic violence, systematic, severe, routine domestic violence, in working-class communities across England. Cobb had collected evidence. She had spoken to magistrates and police officers, and the women who had survived. What she described was a world in which a significant proportion of married women in working-class districts experienced regular physical violence from their husbands, and in which the law provided almost no protection against it. Not because violence was legal, it was not, technically. A man could be prosecuted for assault. But the prosecutions rarely happened, the fines were small when they did, and the magistrates who heard the cases routinely dismissed them, or minimised them, or sent the woman home with advice to better manage her husband's temper. The law existed on paper. It did not exist in practice, not in any way that reached into the working-class households where the violence was happening. Cobb named the specific geography of the problem. She had identified what she called kicking districts, areas in industrial cities where wife-beating was so common and so tolerated that it had developed its own local culture and even its own local slang. The men who beat their wives in these districts were not social outcasts. They were ordinary members of their communities. Their behaviour was known and if not approved of exactly, then at least not strenuously objected to by those around them. The women who bore the beatings were equally ordinary. Their condition was the expected background condition of their married lives. Cobb's essay was widely read. It was shocking, and it was meant to be. It named what it was describing. It used the word torture. It insisted on taking seriously what women were saying was happening to them, and it argued, with the controlled anger of someone who has thought very carefully about this and is choosing every word, that the law's failure to protect married women from physical violence was not an accident. It was a consequence of the same legal framework that had disappeared women at the altar. If a wife had no independent legal existence, if her husband was in some sense legally identical to her, then his violence against her body was a matter the law could barely see, let alone address. The essay helped produce, in 1878, the Matrimonial Causes Act of that year, which allowed magistrates to grant separation orders to women whose husbands had been convicted of assault. This was something. It was a very small something, in the face of a very large problem, but it was movement. It acknowledged that a husband's violence against his wife was a legal matter, not merely a private one. But here is what Cobb's essay did not address, because it could not, because the society she was writing in had no language for it, or rather had language that no court would accept. The violence she documented was the visible kind, the kind that left marks, the kind that happened in public sometimes, or that produced injuries a doctor could certify, the kind, in other words, that at least existed in the space where evidence could be gathered. What happened in the bedroom, the other kind of violation, the one that happened privately in the dark, without marks, without witnesses, was still entirely outside the territory that reformers could reach. Because to reach it, you would first have to challenge the premise that made it invisible. You would have to challenge Hale's irrevocable consent. You would have to argue that a wife's no was a meaningful word rather than a legal nullity. And that argument, in the 1870s and 1880s, was not one that English law was ready to hear. There were women who made the argument anyway. Josephine Butler, who led the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, those extraordinary pieces of legislation that subjected women suspected of prostitution to forced medical examinations, used the language of bodily autonomy with striking directness. Her argument was that a woman's body was her own, that no state, no medical system, no legal framework had the right to subject it to examination and violation without her consent, that the principle of bodily sovereignty was universal. It did not stop at the door of a brothel, and it did not stop at the door of a bedroom. Butler was speaking specifically about the Contagious Diseases Acts and the women affected by them, but the principle she articulated was not limited to that context, and the women who were listening to her knew it. The idea that a woman's body was her own, that her consent was required, was meaningful, was legally significant, was radical in the precise sense of the word. It went to the root. It challenged the foundation on which the entire structure of coverture and irrevocable consent rested. If the principle was true, if it was genuinely true that a woman's body was her own, then Hale's doctrine was not merely unjust, it was incoherent. You cannot say that a woman's body is her own, and also say that her consent to its use was permanently given at the altar and cannot be withdrawn. The two positions cannot both be true. And the slowly growing women's movement of the later Victorian era was beginning to understand that this contradiction was not a problem to be managed around the edges. It was the centre of the whole question. Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy went further still. Elmy, a member of the Married Women's Property Committee and later the Women's Emancipation Union, wrote about marital rape directly, not as a subject that was too delicate to name, but as a legal and moral wrong that needed to be named and addressed. She used the term, she organised around the principle. She argued, in the 1870s and 1880s, that the marital rape exemption was not merely an anomaly in the law, but an expression of the fundamental disregard for women's bodily autonomy that ran through the entire legal system. Elmy's writing was not widely published in mainstream venues. The argument was too direct, the subject matter too transgressive for the respectable press of the period. She worked through pamphlets and the networks of the women's movement. Her audience was smaller than Cobb's, but the argument she was making was clearer and went further, and it was heard by the women who were building the intellectual framework that would eventually change the law. The women who named it paid a price for naming it. Butler was called immoral for speaking about things that polite women did not speak about. Cobb was dismissed as sensational. Women who organised around the question of bodily autonomy were accused of undermining the institution of marriage, of threatening the family, of importing dangerous continental ideas into the solid English domestic tradition. They kept going, because they had seen the inside of the tradition they were accused of threatening, and they knew what it cost. It is very quiet now. The city outside is asleep or something like asleep. The gas lamps are still burning. The night is still cold. Somewhere a woman is listening to reformers she has never met make arguments about a principle that is keeping her alive, and she does not know that the argument will take another century to win. In 1882, Parliament passed the Married Women's Property Act. It is one of the more significant pieces of Victorian legislation affecting women, and it is worth spending some time with, not only for what it did, but for what it reveals about the speed of legal change and the territories it was and was not willing to enter. The Married Women's Property Act 1882 gave married women in England and Wales the right to own property in their own names. Property they brought to the marriage, property they inherited during the marriage, wages they earned, all of this they could now hold independently, not as their husband's property, not as an extension of him, as their own. You might think this was obvious. You might think that a woman's property being her own was a self-evident proposition that did not require an Act of Parliament to establish. But you would be thinking from inside a different legal tradition than the one that governed Victorian England. Under Coverture, the merging of the wife's legal identity into her husband's was so complete that the concept of the wife owning something independently was not a limitation. It was a logical impossibility. You cannot own something you do not exist to own. You have been subsumed. You are part of someone else. The campaign for the Married Women's Property Act had begun in the 1850s and was organised primarily by women who understood exactly what they were asking for and exactly why the current law was inadequate. Barbara Lee Smith Bodisson, painter, feminist, one of the founders of Girton College, Cambridge, published a pamphlet in 1854 called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women. The title was modestly understated. The content was a clear-eyed account of exactly what coverture meant in legal practice. It was widely distributed and widely read. The women who organised the campaign collected signatures, enormous numbers of signatures, more than 24,000 on the petition presented to Parliament in 1856. They lobbied MPS, they wrote letters to newspapers, they organised public meetings, they did all the things that women without the vote had to do to make their preferences felt by a political system that did not formally acknowledge their existence, and they did it patiently, persistently, for nearly 30 years, until the 1882 Act finally delivered what the 1856 petition had asked for. The 1882 Act cracked the structure of coverture open. It said, "The married woman exists legally as a property-owning entity. She is not wholly subsumed. She retains something of herself that the law will recognise and protect." This was genuine progress. The women who had campaigned for it for decades, and there had been a sustained campaign, petitions, public meetings, parliamentary lobbying, the patient repetitive work of persuasion that characterises all legal reform had achieved something real. But notice what was not in the Act. The Act gave women property rights. It did not give them the right to say no. The irrevocable consent doctrine was untouched. Hale's formulation remained in force. A married woman could now own her income and her inheritance and the objects she brought to the marriage. What she still could not own, in any legal sense, was the decision about what happened to her body in her own home. These two things, property rights and bodily autonomy, might seem like they exist on different levels of human experience. In one sense, they do. The ability to own your wages is a materially important right, affecting your economic security in ways that have real daily consequences. The ability to say no to your husband is a different kind of thing, more intimate, more fundamental, but perhaps not, in the Victorian legal imagination, something that the law could or should address. But the connection between them was understood by the women who were fighting for both. Because economic independence and bodily autonomy were not separate questions. They were the same question approached from different angles. The question was, does a married woman exist as a person, a full, independent, rights-bearing person within the law? Or does she exist as a category of dependent, protected and managed but not recognised as having interests that override those of her husband? The 1882 Act moved the dial toward personhood. It acknowledged that there was a wife self that persisted through the marriage, that retained identity and ownership, and some form of legal existence independent of her husband. This was the first crack in the foundation of coverture. Crucially, the 1882 Act also changed the economic dynamics of the question we are tracing. When a wife had no independent property, when her wages and her inheritance all belonged to her husband, her economic dependence on him was total. This total dependence was relevant to the question of the cold bedroom, because it meant that a woman had no independent resources with which to leave, to establish herself elsewhere, to create the conditions for a life not subject to his authority. She was economically captive. After 1882, this changed slowly. A woman with independent property had, at least in theory, the economic foundations for independence. She could accumulate resources that were her own. She could plan. She could leave if she had somewhere to go and enough to live on. The property rights were not sufficient by themselves. There were still children and social stigma and the practical difficulties of establishing an independent life in a world that was not arranged to accommodate the separated wife. But they were something. They created possibility. What would follow over the next century was the slow and uneven work of widening that crack. The suffrage campaign, which ran at increasing intensity through the 1890s and 1900s and reached its most dramatic moments in the years before the First World War, was part of it. The argument that women should vote was, at its core, an argument that women existed as political persons, that their interests and their judgments were as legitimate as men's, that the democratic franchise, which was supposed to represent the governed, was missing half of the governed. The suffragists and the suffragettes, the constitutionalists and the militants, Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst and the thousands of women who marched and petitioned and went to prison and force-fed and refused, were fighting for the vote. But they were also, implicitly, fighting for the principle that underpinned it, the principle of women's full personhood. And full personhood, if it meant anything, meant the right to say no. This was not always explicit in the suffrage campaign. The suffrage organisations were careful about what they asked for the same reason that Caroline Norton had been careful in her pamphlets, and Josephine Butler had been careful in her arguments. You asked for the minimum necessary to win. You did not ask for everything you needed, because everything you needed was too much for the room to bear. But the logic was there, and the women who were thinking most carefully about the women's movement understood the logic. If you won the vote, if women were acknowledged as citizens whose political preferences deserved representation, then the argument that a woman's consent to the use of her body was irrevocable, permanent, given at the altar and non-retractable forever after, became much harder to sustain. The two positions were in tension. You could not easily have a world in which women were full political persons and also a world in which women's marital consent was a legal fiction arranged by a judge 300 years ago. The tension was not resolved immediately. It was not resolved when women got the vote, in 1918 and then in 1928. It was not resolved in the decades that followed. The doctrine of irrevocable consent continued to sit in English law, cited, relied upon, used to dismiss cases, through the 20th century, through the Second World War, through the post-war Reconstruction, through the 1960s and the sexual revolution, and the women's liberation movement, and all the decades of cultural change that were supposed to have settled the question of what women were and what rights they held. It was still there in 1990. It was still law in England and Wales. So Matthew Hale's irrevocable consent had outlasted the Victorian era, outlasted the suffrage movement, outlasted the 20th century's revolution in how the world thought about gender, and was still governing the bodies of married women in the age of Margaret Thatcher and the Sony Walkman and the Channel 4 weather forecast. We will get to 1991 in time, but first we need to walk through the years between, because the gap between what the law said and what the culture was beginning to understand widened over the course of those decades into something that could no longer be ignored. It is easy to talk about legal doctrines and reform campaigns and the slow arc of women's rights without spending enough time in the actual rooms where Victorian women lived. The law is important. The campaigns are important. But the law was experienced inside houses, and the houses had particular textures and particular smells and particular rhythms that shaped how the law's abstractions landed in individual lives. Let us go inside for a moment. Let us try to understand what the inside felt like. You are a married woman in a comfortable middle-class household in the 1870s. The house is in a terrace, not the grand houses of the wealthy, but the solid, respectable terraces that the Victorian middle class built in their millions, the houses with the small front gardens and the iron railings and the parlour kept clean for visitors. There is a cook and a maid, because you are prosperous enough for that, though not so prosperous that you do not need to manage carefully. Your day begins early. There are instructions to be given to the cook. There is the household budget to be reviewed, which is to say the household budget your husband has given you, the amount he has determined is appropriate for the running of the house. If you have managed particularly well, there is occasionally a small residue at the end of the week. This residue is yours in practice, if not precisely in law. You keep it in a drawer in the bedroom, you do not mention it. The children need attending to, or rather the children's governess needs supervising. There are calls to make. The social obligations of the middle-class wife, the visits to other women in similar houses, the exchange of information and company that forms the fabric of respectable social life. These calls are not frivolous. They are the work of maintaining the social network that provides support, information, occasional help. They are also, sometimes, the only time you see another adult during the day who might understand what your life is like. Because the domestic sphere, for all the Victorian poetry about its sacredness, for all the sermons about the wife as the moral centre of the home, is very quiet. It is very enclosed. The husband leaves in the morning and returns in the evening, and in between there is the house and the children and the servants and the calls, and there is very little that reaches the outside world and very little that comes in from it. What does come in are the books. Victorian women read enormously. They had the time for it, and the circulating libraries provided the material, and the fiction of the period is dense with women who are reading and thinking and finding in novels a version of life more fully experienced than the one available to them in the parlour. The sensation novels of the 1860s, the books by Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon that were wildly popular and deeply controversial, were popular in part because they were about women in exactly this situation. Women trapped in respectable houses, trapped in marriages, trapped by legal structures that made them invisible, and doing terrible and dramatic things to escape. The readers knew what they were reading about. They were reading about themselves, in slightly more dramatic form, the bigamy plots, and the hidden mad women and the secrets buried in the garden. These were the sensation novels' exaggerations of truths that were not sensational at all. They were ordinary. They were the daily reality of the enclosed domestic sphere. Lady Audley, in Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, the novel that outsold almost everything else published in 1862, commits bigamy and attempts murder to escape the constraints of her first marriage. Victorian critics were horrified. Victorian women readers apparently were not. The novel sold in extraordinary numbers. The woman at the circulating library who borrowed it, who read it by candlelight in the parlour after her husband had gone to bed, who returned it with the pages slightly smudged, she was not shocked by Lady Audley. She understood her. What about the evenings? The husband returns. Dinner is served, past the proper Victorian dinner, the sequence of courses that the cook has prepared and the maid has presented, the ritual of the family meal. Conversation happens. The husband speaks of his day, his work, his opinions. You contribute. You are educated enough to contribute. You have read the newspaper, which arrives in the morning and which you have worked through carefully, because it is one of your connections to the world beyond the house. After dinner there is the parlour. He may read, or he may have a visitor, or he may go out. You may sew, or read, or play the piano. If there are children old enough to be up at this hour, they are present. There is, in the better marriages, conversation. There is, in the good ones, genuine companionship. The Victorian ideal of marriage was not simply a property arrangement. It was supposed to be a partnership of affection, and many Victorian marriages were affectionate by the standards available. But what were those standards? They did not include the standard we are examining tonight. They did not include the standard that would have given a woman legal recourse if something she did not want happened in the bedroom. The affection was real in many cases. The legal structure was also real, always underneath the affection, and the legal structure said that there were things she could not refuse. This is the texture of the Victorian marriage for the woman in it. The days are full and managed and not unhappy, in many cases, not tragic in the obvious ways. The problem is not always spectacular. Very often it is quiet. It is the absence of something. The absence of the ability to say a certain word and have it mean something. The absence of a legal self that the law would stand behind if she needed it to. The absence is present in the house the way cold is present. You cannot point to it. You can feel it. Let's think about the working class woman for a moment, because a situation is different in degree if not in kind. She lives in a back-to-back in one of the industrial cities, or in one of the crowded terraces around the factory gates. Her house does not have a parlour for calling visitors. It has a kitchen and a bedroom, and if she's lucky it has a scullery. She does not have a cook or a maid. She is the cook and the maid. She works, often, in a factory before marriage, or in a laundry, or taking in lodgers or sewing or whatever the local economy offers. Her wages go to the household, which is to say they went to her husband, because the Married Women's Property Act has not yet been passed. Her day is longer than the middle-class wife's, and harder. She carries coal. She wrings out wet laundry with hands that are red from the water. She manages the weekly budget with a precision that makes the middle-class household budget look extravagant because there is less, and the less is needed for more. She feeds the children first. She eats what remains. Her husband's violence, if there is violence, is not managed by the careful social negotiation available to her middle-class counterpart. There is no separate bedroom. There is no medical authority to appeal to. There is sometimes a woman neighbour who knows, who has listened through the wall, who has offered what help she can, which is very little. And the intimate violation, if there is intimate violation, the thing that happens in the dark, the thing that has no name, the thing that the law has declared does not happen, happens in a room with thin walls and no lock on the door and nothing on the other side of it but the street. She does not tell anyone. There is no one to tell. There is no language for it, and there is no law behind the language, and even if there were a law, she would have to live with the man tomorrow and the day after. She lies very still. The night passes, the morning comes, and the morning is another morning exactly like the one before, because the law has not changed overnight, and the law will not change for a very long time. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The 20th century arrived with more noise than the 19th had made. There were motor cars in the streets, and electric lights in the better houses, and a telephone in the post office, and women standing outside Parliament with banners that read, "Votes for women and deeds, not words." The suffrage campaign, by 1910, had been running for decades, and had shifted from polite petition to something that disturbed the air. Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union had been founded in 1903, and by the years before the First World War it was conducting a campaign of direct action. Window smashing in London's West End, arson attacks on postboxes, hunger strikes in Holloway Prison, women throwing themselves under horses at Epsom and being force-fed in prison cells by the same state that was refusing to acknowledge their existence as political persons. Emily Wilding Davison, who died at Epsom Racecourse in June 1913 after being struck by the King's Horse during the Derby, became the movement's most visible martyr. Whether she intended to die is still debated. What is not debated is what she was doing there. She was making a claim about women's existence in public life so insistent that it required her presence at one of the country's most prominent public events, at a moment when the eyes of the country were on the track with the suffragette flag sewn into her coat. It is worth thinking about the force-feeding for a moment. When a woman in prison refused to eat, the state's response was to restrain her, insert a tube through her nose or mouth, and pour food into her body without her consent. The suffragette movement made the comparison explicit. What the state was doing to imprisoned women's bodies was, in miniature, what it had always done to married women's bodies. It was treating the female body as an object to be managed, not a person to be heard. It was saying, your refusal is not meaningful. We will do what we determine needs to be done. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst understood this. Their campaign, increasingly, was not only about the vote, it was about the principle of women's personhood. The vote was the specific demand. The personhood was what the demand was made of. The First World War, which came in 1914 and consumed 4 years of the century, changed things in ways that were real but partial. Women worked in the factories and the hospitals and the fields. They drove ambulances and managed organisations and did, in ways both visible and invisible, a significant share of the work of keeping the country functional, while its men were in the trenches. The old argument, that women did not participate in the work of the nation in ways that warranted political representation, was difficult to sustain against the evidence of what women were actually doing. But there was something else happening in the years around the First World War that is less often discussed in the context of the women's movement. The social reformers, the public health campaigners, the women working in the settlement houses and the mothers' clinics and the organisations that were attempting to address the conditions of working-class life. They were accumulating evidence about what women's lives actually contained, about the physical consequences of poverty and overwork and repeated pregnancy, and the kind of domestic conditions that left no room for anything that might be called self-determination. Marie Stopes, who opened her first birth control clinic in 1921, was working in this territory. Her book Married Love, published in 1918, addressed, with extraordinary directness for the period, the question of women's sexual experience within marriage. She argued for the importance of mutual pleasure, for the significance of women's desire, for the idea that the sexual relationship in a marriage was a matter of two people and not one. She addressed the question of unwanted pregnancy. She addressed the relationship between women's economic dependence and their inability to control the number of children they bore. Stopes was not, in this work, directly addressing the legal doctrine we have been discussing. She was not making a legal argument. She was making a cultural argument. She was saying that marriage was supposed to be something other than what many women were actually experiencing it as. But the cultural argument and the legal argument were part of the same conversation. The culture she was describing was a culture shaped by the legal structure. The marriages she was trying to reform were marriages operating within a legal framework that had declared the wife's consent irrevocable. In 1918, women over 30 who met a property qualification were given the vote. In 1928, the qualification was removed and all women over 21 could vote on the same terms as men. This was enormous. This was the thing they had been fighting for, and yet the doctrine of irrevocable consent was still there. Sir Matthew Hale's formulation, unchanged since 1736, was still being cited in English courts, still being used to establish that a husband could not be convicted of raping his wife, still telling married women that the word they said in the dark was a word the law would not listen to. How was this possible? How could the law acknowledge women as political persons, as voters, as citizens, as people whose preferences deserve to shape the government of the country, and simultaneously maintain that the same women had given permanent, irrevocable consent to the use of their bodies at the moment of marriage, consent that could not be withdrawn under any circumstances? The answer is that the law is not a logical system, it is an accumulation. It is layers of precedent and statute and judicial interpretation built up over centuries, and the layers do not always talk to each other. A woman could have the vote and still be subject to Hale's doctrine because the vote was granted by Parliament, and Hale's doctrine was maintained by the common law, and the two systems moved at different speeds and responded to different pressures. But the contradiction was real, and as the decades passed it became more visible. The post-war world was changing. The women who had worked in factories and driven ambulances and managed organisations during the war had a different relationship to the idea of their own capacity and their own rights than the women who had been raised on Victorian conduct books. The culture was shifting. The Second World War shifted it again. Another generation of women working in roles that had previously been unavailable, another demonstration of female capacity, another deferral of legal recognition. After 1945, the welfare state was built, the National Health Service was created, the country reorganised itself around a new set of social promises. Equality was in the air. Equality of class, equality of opportunity. The idea that a person's life chances should not be entirely determined by the accident of birth. But the bedroom was still private. The marital bedroom was still outside the reach of the law. A woman could vote and receive health care and work in any number of professions that had been closed to her grandmother and still have no legal recourse if what happened in her bedroom was something she had not consented to. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s named this with new directness. The language had changed. The vocabulary of the movement was not the careful, qualified language of Victorian reformers asking for modest protections. It was a language of rights, of women's rights as human rights, of the body as fundamentally one's own, of consent as something that had to be affirmatively given, continuously, and that could be withdrawn. The slogan that emerged from this period, "No means no," sounds simple because it is simple. It is also, in its simplicity, a radical challenge to 250 years of legal tradition that had said the opposite. No, in the marital bedroom, had meant nothing. The movement was insisting that this was wrong, that it had always been wrong, that the law needed to catch up. The law was still not ready. But the distance between what the law said and what the culture understood had become, by the 1980s, a kind of public scandal. Cases came before the courts. Judges struggled with the doctrine. Some found ways to narrow it, to limit it, to declare that in this particular circumstance the irrevocable consent did not apply, where the parties were formally separated perhaps, or where the wife had obtained an injunction. But the foundation, Hale's formulation, irrevocable consent, was still there. It would take one more case, one more woman, one more courtroom, and a House of Lords that was finally willing to say what had been obvious to anyone paying attention for at least a century. The case is known in legal reports as R versus R. The R stands for Regina, the Crown, as it stands in all criminal cases. The second R is the defendant, whose name is not published in the reports, as is the convention with sexual offence cases. The facts, as stated in the judgments, are these. A husband and wife in England had separated. They were living apart. The wife had left the matrimonial home. The husband had gone to her parents' house where she was staying and had entered and forced sexual intercourse upon her. She did not consent. She said no. He was charged with rape and attempted rape. His defence, at trial, relied on the Hale doctrine. He argued that by virtue of marriage his wife had given irrevocable consent, and that therefore what he had done could not constitute rape regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the separation, regardless of what she had said. The judge at trial rejected this argument. The husband was convicted. He appealed. The Court of Appeal upheld the conviction, rejecting the Hale doctrine on the facts of the case. A case involving formal separation, they said, was a different matter. The defendant appealed to the House of Lords. And here, in October 1991, 5 law lords heard the arguments and delivered a judgment that was unanimous and unequivocal. The irrevocable consent doctrine was wrong. It had always been wrong. It should no longer be applied. A husband could be convicted of raping his wife. Lord Keith of Kinkle delivered the leading judgment. What he said has the quality of a thing that is very obvious, stated very carefully, in the formal language of the highest court in the land. He said that Hale's proposition, as Hale himself had conceded, had no judicial authority behind it when it was written. It was Hale's opinion. It had been treated as law because it had been repeated often enough to become accepted. But acceptance and correctness are not the same thing. He said that the status of women in society had changed out of all recognition since the 17th century, and that the law must recognise this. He quoted the principle that the common law is capable of evolving to meet the changing conditions of society. He applied that principle here. He said that the fiction of irrevocable implied consent had no place in the modern law. Lord Lowry, in a concurring judgment, went further in his analysis of what the Hale doctrine actually was. He observed that the statement in Hale's treatise was tentative, even by its own terms. Hale had himself acknowledged that there were circumstances in which the implied consent might not apply. Over the centuries this nuance had been lost. The doctrine had hardened from a tentative observation into a firm rule through the power of repetition alone. This was not good law. It had never been good law. It was an unexamined assumption that had been codified through inertia. The judgment is clear in its rejection, but it is equally clear that the rejection is overdue. There is no triumphalism in it, no sense that the law has arrived at this conclusion promptly or creditably. There is rather the quiet tone of a court that is tidying up something that should have been tidied up long ago and knows it. Outside the formal language there are things the judgment does not say and cannot say. It cannot restore anything to the women who came before. It cannot speak to the Victorian woman in her cold bedroom, or the woman in the 1920s, or the woman in the 1960s who said no and heard no law behind her. It cannot account for what those years cost in the aggregate to the millions of women for whom the irrevocable consent doctrine was not an abstract legal principle, but a daily lived reality. After the judgment, the media coverage was extensive. The conviction and the appeal had been followed in the press. The decision provoked commentary across the political spectrum. Most of it acknowledged that the old law was wrong. Some of it, a smaller portion, expressed concern about the implications for marriage, about the difficulty of proving consent in an intimate relationship, about the intrusion of the law into the private sphere. These concerns were real, in the sense that they were genuinely felt by the people expressing them, but they were also concerns that had been used, in various forms, to delay this change for many decades. The concern about intrusion into the private sphere was the same concern that had been expressed in the debates around the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act. The concern about the difficulty of proof was real, but was also present in all rape prosecutions, not only in the marital context. The concerns had weight, but they did not ultimately outweigh the principle. The Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 put the judgment into statute, incorporating marital rape into the definition of rape in English law. The legal framework was now, at last, in the place that common sense and basic human dignity had suggested it should be for 255 years. That number again. 255 years between Hale's formulation in 1736 and the House of Lords' rejection of it in 1991. A woman born in 1736 could have lived her entire life, died, and had her great-great-great-granddaughters live their entire lives and die, and her great-great-great-great-granddaughters be born and grow to adulthood, and all of them would have lived under the same doctrine. In that same time, Britain had built and partially dismantled an empire. It had industrialized. It had fought a dozen major wars. It had rebuilt its cities, its institutions, its economy. It had extended the franchise from a small propertied elite to every adult citizen. It had created a welfare state. It had, in ways large and small, reconceived almost every fundamental institution of social life. But in the bedroom, in the dark, the doctrine remained. The irrevocable consent remained. The word no remained without legal meaning. What does it mean to hold that truth? Not abstractly, as a historical fact to be noted and filed, but really hold it, to allow its weight to register. It means that for 255 years the law of England told married women that there were things they could not refuse. It means that every generation of married women in that period, including the women of our own grandmothers and mothers' generations, lived within a legal structure that had made that declaration. It means that the campaigns, the reform efforts, the suffragists and suffragettes, the women's liberation movement, the decades of cultural change, all of it happened in the presence of that doctrine, circling around it, unable or unwilling or not yet strong enough to pull it down. And it means that when it finally came down not through legislation, not through a formal democratic process, but through a court case, through a woman who said no, and through the prosecution that took her case seriously, and through judges who were finally willing to say that the doctrine they had inherited was wrong. One woman, in 1991, in a case whose name obscures her identity, contributed to the ending of a legal tradition that had governed the bodies of millions of women for 2.5 centuries. She does not know that we are here tonight thinking about her. She does not know about the Victorian woman in the cold bedroom lying very still. She does not know about the letters that stopped mid-sentence. She does not know about the women who campaigned and wrote and were dismissed as sensational or immoral or too demanding. She does not know about all of it. But the thread runs through all of them, the same thread, the same truth at the end of it. England and Wales were not alone. The Hale doctrine, or variations of it, existed in most of the legal systems that had inherited the English common law tradition, which is to say, in much of the world that had been shaped by the British Empire. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, and many other jurisdictions had built their legal frameworks on the same foundation, and the same exemption, the marital rape exemption, was part of that foundation everywhere it had spread. The American story is worth dwelling on, because the timeline is in some ways more dramatic than the English one. The United States, with its federal system, handled the question state by state, rather than through a single national decision, and this meant that the reform happened at different speeds in different places, and the full picture took decades to assemble. The first American state to criminalize marital rape was Nebraska in 1976. This was the year after the United Nations designated 1975 as International Women's Year, the year that the feminist movement in the United States was at something close to its peak cultural influence, the year that enough had changed, culturally, politically, in terms of what people were willing to say in public, that a state legislature was willing to say that a husband could be convicted of raping his wife. Nebraska was first. The last was North Carolina, in 1993, 2 years after the House of Lords decision in England. In between, the other 48 states and the District of Columbia criminalized marital rape one by one, on different dates and with different provisions. Some states criminalized it fully. Some created partial exemptions, situations in which the marital relationship reduced the seriousness of the offence, or shortened the statute of limitations, or required the prosecution to meet a higher standard of evidence. The debates in American state legislatures during this period, the late 1970s through the early 1990s, are a remarkable record of the arguments made in defence of the exemption at the moment of its repeal. Some legislators argued that the change would lead to false accusations, that wives would weaponize the law against their husbands in the course of divorce proceedings. Some argued that it was impossible to define what consent meant within the context of an ongoing intimate relationship. Some argued that the bedroom remained a private sphere into which the law should not intrude. Some argued that the reform was unnecessary because the law of assault already provided adequate protection. All of these arguments had been made before. They were the Victorian arguments in modern clothing. The concern about false accusations was the concern that had always been used to limit the legal recognition of rape. The argument about the impossibility of defining consent was the argument that had always been used to make women's testimony less credible than men's. The argument about the private sphere was the argument that had protected everything that happened inside marriages from legal scrutiny since the doctrine of coverture was first articulated. What had changed by the 1970s and 1980s was not the arguments but the audience for them. The audience had shifted. Enough people, in enough state legislatures, were no longer persuaded by the old arguments. The cultural ground had moved sufficiently that the arguments had lost their purchase. This is not a particularly inspiring account of how legal change happens. It is not a story of sudden enlightenment or moral breakthrough. It is a story of slow drift, of the gradual accumulation of enough changed minds that the old position became politically unsustainable. These partial exemptions tell you something important about the persistence of the underlying idea. Even after the formal legal barrier was removed, even after the law acknowledged that a husband could rape his wife, there was a residual unwillingness in some legal systems to treat marital rape as fully equivalent to other rape. There was a desire to maintain a distinction, to say that what happened in a marriage was, in some sense, different from what happened between strangers, that the intimacy of the marital relationship, even if it did not provide legal immunity, at least provided some form of mitigation. The feminist legal scholars who were writing about this period in the 1980s and 1990s named the distinction clearly. They said that the retention of any special treatment for marital rape, any reduction in penalty, any additional hurdle for prosecution, there was a continuation of the same logic that had produced the marital rape exemption in the first place. It was the law saying, we acknowledge that this can happen, but we also believe that it is somehow less when it happens inside a marriage, less harmful, less worthy of the law's full response. The argument against this position is not difficult to make. The argument is that rape within a marriage is not less harmful than rape by a stranger. The experience of it is, if anything, more complicated, more intimate in its violation, more difficult to process, more entangled with the other textures of a life shared with another person. The harm is not reduced by the relationship. In many cases, it is compounded by it. Australia's experience provides another variation on the story. The Australian states criminalised marital rape at different times during the 1980s and 1990s, and the debates in Australian legislatures and courts rehearsed many of the same arguments. The Victorian connection was not only chronological. Australia had inherited English common law, including Hale's doctrine, through the colonial legal system. The doctrine that had governed the cold bedroom in Victorian England had travelled to the other side of the world and settled there equally firmly. By the early 2000s, most of the special provisions in American law had been repealed or reformed. The legal landscape across the English-speaking world had largely converged on the position that the House of Lords had stated in 1991. Marital rape is rape. The marital relationship provides no exemption and no mitigation. But the legal change came after a very long time, and in other parts of the world the change has been even slower. As of the early 21st century, marital rape remains explicitly legal in a significant number of countries where the legal codes either have no provision against it or have specific exemptions that protect husbands. The Hale doctrine, or its local equivalent, is still governing women's bodies in those places. This is not an ancient legal hangover that exists only in places that have not modernised. It exists in places with parliaments and courts and constitutions. It exists in places that are parties to international human rights conventions. It exists in places where women vote and work and participate in public life in ways that Victorian women would have found unimaginable. The separation between political personhood and bodily autonomy that existed in Victorian England, the ability to be a citizen in some domains and not in others, has not disappeared from the world. It has only become smaller and more visible, And visibility, as the Victorian reform movement understood, is the beginning of change. The reformers who worked on these issues in the 1970s and 1980s, Susan Brown Miller, Diana Russell, Catherine McKinnon, the women who brought together legal theory and feminist analysis, and the testimony of women who had survived, were explicit about the connection between the specific legal reform and the larger principle. You could not simply change the law and leave the underlying attitude undisturbed. The law reflected an attitude, and the attitude was the problem, and the attitude was that women's no was a conditional thing, dependent on context, subject to the interpretation of whoever was doing the interpreting. No means no was a slogan before it was a legal principle. It was a cultural statement before it was a courtroom statement. It was something women said to each other, and then to the public, and then to legislators and judges, over the course of decades, until enough of the world was willing to hear it that the law could no longer say otherwise. The Victorian woman in the cold bedroom did not have that slogan. She did not have the language. She lay very still and found her own accommodations with the world as it was, because the world as she needed it to be was not available to her yet. She did not know that a woman in 1991 would stand in a courtroom and contribute to the ending of the doctrine that governed her bedroom. She did not know about Nebraska in 1976 or North Carolina in 1993. She knew the cold, she knew the dark, she knew the sound of a man's breathing and the particular quality of stillness that was the only protection available to her. Let us sit with that for a moment. Let us let the weight of it settle, not with anger, though anger is entirely appropriate, but with the particular kind of attention that history deserves, the attention that says, this happened, to people who were real, in rooms that were real, and it happened for a very long time, and the ending of it required more courage than we generally acknowledge. We have been circling around the individual women, the Victorian woman in the cold bedroom, the woman of the 1960s, the woman in the 1991 case, without spending enough time with the specific evidence they left. There is evidence, fragmentary, coded, difficult to read, but there, and it is worth sitting with, because it is the closest we can come to the reality of what the law's silence meant for the women who lived inside it. The Victorian diary is a particular kind of document. Women kept diaries in enormous numbers in the 19th century, partly because writing was one of the domestic accomplishments taught to middle-class girls, partly because the enclosed domestic life provided both the time and the impulse to record. These diaries were often kept with the expectation that they might be read, by family members, by posterity. This meant that the self-censorship built into them was considerable. But even through the self-censorship, patterns emerge. There are diaries that record the progress of a marriage with careful positivity and then develop gaps, weeks of silence that are then resumed with no explanation. The gap is not noted. The life that was being recorded simply stops briefly and then continues. Historians who work with these documents learn to read the gaps as carefully as the text. There are letters between women friends, the women who corresponded with each other across the distances of the Victorian world, whose letters were sometimes preserved and sometimes destroyed, and sometimes preserved by the recipient's family without the writer's knowledge or consent. These letters, when they touch on the difficult territory, do so obliquely. A woman writes to her closest friend that she is not well, that she has been tired, that things at home have been trying, that she does not like to say more in a letter. She does not like to say more in a letter. This phrase, or variations of it, appears repeatedly in Victorian women's correspondence. It signals the existence of something that cannot be written down, something that the writer knows the recipient will understand because they share the context, they share the world, they understand what is not being said. What is not being said is almost always about the husband, about something that is happening, or not happening, or happening in a way that is wrong. The letter is the closest the Victorian woman could come to, speaking aloud about the thing that had no name, and even in the letter to the closest friend she had, she does not like to say more. Some diaries encode themselves in ways that historians have only recently begun to decode. The shorthand systems used by some Victorian women diarists, systems that look, at first glance, like ordinary stenographic notation, occasionally turn out to contain material written in private code, a second layer of text beneath the first. These discoveries are rare, but they suggest that some women developed their own technical solutions to the problem of the witness diary. the diary that could not say what it needed to say because it might be found. Anne Lister is sometimes cited in this context, though her case is particular. Lister, who lived in the first half of the 19th century and is now best known from the television series based on her life, kept a diary in code, a code she and a friend had devised together, specifically to record the things she could not write in plain text. The code gave her access to a private language for her private life, her sexual life, the parts of herself she could not present to the world. Most Victorian women did not have a code. Most of them wrote in plain text, and the plain text had limits, and the limits were enforced by the knowledge that someone might read it. The result is a historical record full of silences, full of things almost said and then retreated from, full of the particular shape of something unspoken. The late 19th century social reform literature gives us more explicit material, because it was produced by women who were deliberately speaking in public about things that women had previously only spoken about in private. Frances Power Cobb's Wife Torture in England, which we have already met, included testimony from women who had experienced violence. The testimony was presented through Cobb's framing. It was selected and shaped by her, but the specific details were there, the specific descriptions of specific things that had happened to specific women. What is striking, reading this literature now, is not the exceptional quality of the violence it describes. What is striking is the ordinariness of it. These were not unusual cases selected for their shock value. They were representative cases. They were what regularly happened. The violence documented in Cobb's essay was not rare. It was the expected background condition of a significant proportion of working-class marriages, and Cobb was saying so clearly, in print, in a major periodical, because saying so clearly in print was the only tool she had. The women who gave testimony to the social reform organisations of the late Victorian period, to the various organisations that were documenting the conditions of working-class life, gave it knowing that it would be read, selected, and used. They gave it anyway. The willingness to say, in front of strangers, what had happened to them, was itself a form of courage. They were speaking into a world that had no legal category for their experience and no cultural language for it, into the silence that the law had created and insisting that the silence was wrong. This is one of the things that gets lost in the historical record of the women's movement, the specific courage of the women who gave testimony, not the named reformers, the Cobbs and the Butlers and the Nortons whose names we remember, but the unnamed women who stood in front of committees and speaking societies and journalists and said what had happened to them in their marriages, who provided the evidence that made the reform argument possible, who allowed their experience to be used as data in an argument for a change that they might not live to see. The 20th century evidence is more explicit because the culture had begun to develop language for it. By the time the women's liberation movement of the 1970s began holding consciousness-raising groups, small gatherings of women in living rooms and community halls, where they talked about their lives and their experiences and slowly, together, developed a vocabulary for things that had previously had no name. The dam had begun to break. The speak-outs that the movement organised, public events where women stood up and described what had happened to them, in legal terms a form of testimony for which there was no court and no legal process, were the most explicit acknowledgement yet that the private had been political all along. The intimate violations that had been happening in private in the dark for generations were not private matters. They were political matters. They were matters for which the law bore responsibility, and naming them publicly was the beginning of forcing the law to respond. Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will, published in 1975, brought the analysis together in a form that was read widely outside the movement. It argued that rape, including marital rape, was not a private crime but a social institution, a form of systematic control that functioned across society and through time. It provided a historical and cultural analysis of sexual violence that was new in its comprehensiveness and its insistence on taking seriously what women said had happened to them. The book was controversial. Of course it was controversial. Its core argument challenged assumptions that ran very deep, including implicitly the assumption that what happened inside a marriage was a private matter between husband and wife, not a matter for law or politics or public analysis. But it was read. It was argued about. It contributed to the slow, imperfect, incomplete shift in understanding that eventually produced the legal change. The evidence they left is not enough. It is never enough. The women who wrote the coded letters and the gapped diaries and the testimony that was shaped by other people's framing, and the women who stood up at speak-outs, and the women who gave testimony to reform organisations. They left traces, and the traces allow us to gesture toward the experience, but they cannot give it to us fully. The experience itself is gone. It happened in rooms that no longer exist, to people who are no longer alive, and the evidence is fragmentary and mediated and shaped by the silences that the law imposed. What we can do is pay attention to the traces. What we can do is notice the gaps. What we can do is remember that behind every coded letter, behind every stopped diary, behind every not saying more in a letter, there was a person, a real person, in a real room for whom the silence was not an archival gap but a daily condition. We have been talking about what women could not do, what the law would not allow, what the culture would not acknowledge, what the legal system had made invisible. It is also important to talk about what women did, because women are not passive in the face of systems that constrain them. They never have been. They find ways. They develop strategies. They create, in the spaces available to them, forms of resistance and accommodation and survival that the law does not see, and the historical record often does not capture. Some of these strategies were social. The Victorian middle-class woman had access to a network of other women, friends, sisters, cousins, neighbours, whose collective knowledge of how to manage a difficult marriage was a form of distributed expertise, not spoken about openly, not recorded, but transmitted, the understanding that certain medical certificates could be obtained, the knowledge of which doctors were sympathetic, the information about how to present a situation in language that would produce the desired result. This knowledge was real, and it circulated, and it helped some women to create more livable conditions within marriages that were difficult. The working-class woman had a different kind of network. The women who lived in the back-to-back terraces and the court housing of Victorian industrial cities were in each other's lives in ways that the geographically separated middle class was not. They heard through the walls. They were in and out of each other's kitchens. The mutual observation of close-packed communal living was both intrusive and protective. A woman whose husband was being violent had witnesses, even if the witnesses were legally powerless. She had people who knew, and sometimes knowing mattered. The pawnshop played a role in some working-class women's strategies of survival that is rarely discussed but was economically significant. A woman who managed to accumulate small objects, a piece of jewellery, a household item, something that could be removed from the house quietly and converted to cash, had a small emergency fund. The pawnshop was the working-class woman's savings account, except that the deposit required subterfuge and the withdrawal required paying interest. It was not a good system, but it was a system, and the women who used it understood exactly what it was for. Some women developed religious or moral arguments that they deployed privately with their husbands. The Victorian period had a strong tradition of evangelical Christianity that placed real emphasis on self-control and the duties of the Christian husband. A husband who considered himself a Christian gentleman could sometimes be reached through the language of his own values. The argument that a good Christian man did not force himself on a wife who was unwell or in distress, or who had expressed clear reluctance. This argument did not have legal force, but it had moral force in some marriages, with some men. Some women simply said no and relied on the force of their own character and their husband's reluctance to create an actual confrontation. Many men, after all, did not want an actual confrontation. Many men were not looking for a legal excuse to ignore their wife's wishes. They were simply living in a culture that had not trained them to think of those wishes as primary. When the wishes were expressed clearly, some of them responded. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes. This is an important caveat to hold. The legal doctrine was absolute in its language. The cultural reality was more varied. There were Victorian marriages in which the husband was genuinely considerate, in which the wife's comfort and consent were treated as important, in which the power differential encoded in the law was moderated by affection and mutual respect. The existence of the doctrine did not mean that every Victorian husband used it as a charter for violation. Many, perhaps most, did not. But the doctrine's existence was not without consequence even in those marriages, because the doctrine meant that the husband's consideration was a gift, not an obligation. His respect for his wife's wishes was a choice, not a requirement. The law did not require it. The law had already declared that it was unnecessary. which meant that the woman's safety in the marriage depended not on her rights, but on his character. And character, as the historical record makes abundantly clear, is not a reliable foundation for justice. Some women found longer-term strategies, prolonged nursing of an illness, genuine or strategic, that made the cold bedroom inaccessible, extended visits to family, particularly when children arrived, the management of the household schedule so that exhaustion became a plausible reason for early sleep, the cultivation of the husband's interests in social life in ways that kept him occupied. These were not solutions, they were accommodations. They were the creative use of the limited possibilities available to create a small amount of space. Some women, in the later Victorian period and into the 20th century, found in the women's organisations a form of legitimate public activity that could be strategically expanded. The suffrage societies, the temperance movements, the mothers' unions, the charitable organisations, these provided reasons to be out of the house, in company, involved in something beyond the domestic sphere. For some women, this was genuinely their vocation. For others, it served a dual purpose, providing both meaningful activity and a degree of freedom from the house that other social arrangements would not have permitted. The temperance movement is worth noting briefly in this context. The Women's Christian Temperance Union and its equivalents understood, often explicitly, the connection between men's drinking and domestic violence. Women who campaigned against alcohol were, in many cases, women who had experienced the relationship between intoxication and domestic harm at first hand. The campaign against drink was, among other things, a campaign for a safer domestic sphere. It was not a campaign that named the specific wrong we have been discussing tonight. It stayed on the visible violence, not the invisible violation. But it understood the domestic sphere as a site of harm, and sought to reduce the harm through the most politically accessible route available. There is something both admirable and deeply sad about these strategies. Admirable because the creativity and persistence they required were real. Women developed sophisticated social intelligence in the service of their own survival. They became expert at reading the signs of their husband's moods, at timing their own behaviour to minimise conflict, at finding the small windows of leverage available within a very constrained situation. Sad because the strategies should not have been necessary. The creativity and energy and intelligence that went into managing the marital situation was creativity and energy and intelligence that went elsewhere, away from the women themselves, away from their own development and their own interests and their own possibility. The management of an unsafe situation is work, heavy work, and the women who did this work were doing it instead of something else. This something else is the loss that is hardest to account for. We can count the cases that didn't go to court, or at least gesture at their scale. We can point to the letters that stopped. We can identify the diaries with the gaps. What we cannot recover is what the women who lived inside these constraints might have done with the energy they spent managing them. The books not written, the businesses not started, the ideas not pursued, the selves not developed. The Victorian woman is often imagined as someone whose possibilities were limited by education and economics and culture. Someone who did not have access to the full range of human experience because the world was organised to prevent it. This is true, but beneath those limits was another limit, more intimate and more total, the limit of the bedroom, the limit that said, this part of your life is not your own, and the word you say about it is not a word the law will stand behind. It is a limit that shaped everything, that shaped how the woman understood her own body, her own authority, her own capacity to protect herself. That shaped what she believed about what she was owed and what she could ask for and what the world was willing to give her. The law's silence about the marital bedroom was not confined to the bedroom. It extended into every other room in the house and into the woman's understanding of herself as a person in the world. The strategies of survival were real, and the women who developed them deserve our recognition. But the recognition comes with a kind of grief, because the energy of survival is not the energy of flourishing, and the women we're talking about deserve to flourish. The House of Lords judgment in R v R was handed down in October 1991. It was reported in the newspapers. It was discussed on the radio. It prompted editorial comment about the long overdue nature of the change and some puzzlement in certain corners about how the old law had lasted so long. The law lords themselves seemed somewhat bemused by the doctrine they were overturning. not because it was wrong, but because of how obviously, uncomplicatedly wrong it was. Lord Lane, the Lord Chief Justice, had written in the Court of Appeal judgment below, "This is one of those rare occasions when this court has been able to act with some confidence that, in removing a common law fiction, which has become anachronistic and offensive, we are in accordance with the contemporary general consent of those who are subject to the common law." Contemporary general consent. The phrase is doing a lot of work. It suggests that by 1991, the idea that a husband could not be convicted of raping his wife was so obviously wrong that removing it was not controversial. That the fiction had become anachronistic, which is to say, it had fallen so far behind what ordinary people understood to be true that maintaining it was embarrassing. This is accurate as far as it goes. By 1991, the broad public understanding that women's consent was meaningful and that its violation was a crime had developed sufficiently that the old doctrine looked simply bizarre. The magazines on the newsstand talked about consent. The television dramas depicted it. The culture had moved. But culture moving is not the same as culture being transformed. And the transformation that the 1991 judgment was part of, the transformation in how rape law understood consent, how the criminal justice system handled sexual violence cases, how women's testimony was received and evaluated, was not completed in 1991. It is not completed now. The prosecution and conviction rate for rape in England and Wales in the years since 1991 has remained very low. Cases are difficult to bring. They are difficult to win. The experience of going through a rape trial for the complainant, for the woman who has to stand in a courtroom and have her credibility assessed, her sexual history questioned, her account challenged, is an experience that many women decide is not worth the additional harm it causes. The law changed. The courtroom changed more slowly. The culture that populates the courtroom changed more slowly still. Marital rape specifically brings its own complexities. The intimate relationship, the shared history, the absence of the kind of evidence that is sometimes available in stranger rape cases, these make prosecution difficult. The rates of reporting marital rape to police are very low. The rates of conviction relative to reports are lower than for other categories of rape. The law that exists on paper does not translate directly into justice delivered in courtrooms. This is not a reason to minimize the importance of what happened in 1991. The legal change was real and significant. The principle that a husband could be convicted of raping his wife was, at the level of legal principle, an important victory. It meant that the law no longer declared the thing impossible. It meant that a woman who had experienced this violation had, for the first time, a legal category into which her experience could be placed. That matters. Having the legal category matters even when the legal category is not always effectively used, because having it changes what can be said. It changes what can be acknowledged. It creates the possibility of the conversation, the report, the trial, even when those things are not always pursued or successful. In the years after 1991, the broader conversation about consent in English law continued to develop. The Sexual Offences Act 2003 was a significant piece of legislation that overhauled the law of sexual offences more comprehensively than any previous statute. It introduced a clearer statutory definition of consent. It said that consent meant agreeing by choice, with the freedom and capacity to make that choice. This was a meaningful advance. It put into statute a definition that was active rather than passive, that required affirmative agreement rather than simply the absence of objection. The 2003 Act also introduced a set of presumptions about consent in certain circumstances. In those circumstances, the prosecution did not need to prove absence of consent. The law presumed it, and the defendant had to rebut the presumption. This shifted the evidential burden in ways that were significant for how cases were prosecuted. The Victorian woman in the cold bedroom had nothing. She had no legal language. She had no form that could receive her account. She had a silence that was total and officially endorsed. The woman in the 21st century has something. She has the law, she has the language. She has the possibility of being believed, though that possibility is not always realised. She has the right to have her no taken seriously, though the right is not always respected. She has the scaffolding of a legal framework that acknowledges her bodily autonomy as a principle, even if the translation of that principle into practice is still imperfect and incomplete. The distance between nothing and something is enormous. The distance between something and enough is also enormous, and it remains unclosed. What did the women who campaigned for this change believe would happen after they won? The women who fought for the criminalization of marital rape, who wrote about it, organized around it, gave testimony about it, took cases through courts, they knew they were not simply changing a law. They were trying to change what the law communicated to society about women's value and women's self-ownership. The law communicates. When the law says that a certain thing is a crime, it says something about the nature of that thing. It says that this is the kind of wrong that society collectively cannot tolerate. It says that the person who does this thing has injured not only their immediate victim, but the social fabric that protects all of us. The law's definition of rape before 1991 communicated that the marital relationship was a special domain in which women's consent was a legal irrelevance. The law after 1991 communicated something different. The communication is slow, the communication is partial, the communication does not reach everywhere, and where it reaches it is not always heard in the way it is intended. But it is a communication, and the women who fought for it knew that changing what the law communicated was part of changing what the culture believed, and what the culture believed was part of changing what individual men and women understood about themselves and each other. This is the long work, the work that was begun in the Victorian era, by Caroline Norton writing her pamphlets, by Frances Power Cobb documenting wife torture, by Josephine Butler arguing for bodily autonomy, by the suffragists and suffragettes who insisted on women's political personhood, is not finished. It is a long work, and it is still happening. The Victorian woman in the cold bedroom did not know about any of this. She knew her room and her bed, and the particular quality of the cold, and the particular quality of the stillness she had learned to inhabit. She was not historical. She was just there, in her life, with what was available to her. We know about the long work because we are further along it than she was. We can see the shape of it from here, the arc from 1736 to 1991 and beyond. We can name what she could not name. We can say the word that the law of her time had no place for. We say it on her behalf. We say it on behalf of all of them. It is very late now. The night has deepened to the particular quality it has in the last hours before dawn. Not quite dark, but not yet the grey of approaching morning. A specific shade of stillness. The kind of stillness in which things can be heard that are normally drowned out by the ordinary noise of the world. We have travelled a long way tonight. From 1736 and a judge's opinion in a posthumous legal textbook, through the Victorian era and its careful, coded women, through the reform campaigns and the suffrage movement and the Property Acts and the 20th century's slow awakening, to the House of Lords in 1991 and the judgment that ended a doctrine older than the United States of America. What can we say now from the vantage point of this quiet hour about what we have seen? We can say that the women who lived under the doctrine of irrevocable consent were not passive in its face. They were creative and persistent and resourceful within the constraints available to them. They developed strategies and networks and the kind of social intelligence that comes from long practice at managing difficult situations from a position of limited power. They found ways to say, within the language available to them, that something was wrong. They found ways to transmit that knowledge across generations, in the letters, in the gaps, in the careful circumlocutions that stand, to those who know how to read them, as a kind of testimony. We can say that the reform came slowly because change that requires those in power to acknowledge that they have had illegitimate power is always slow. The men who made the law were not, in the main, deliberately cruel. They were men who had inherited a legal system and a set of assumptions about the world, and who operated within those assumptions with perfect sincerity. The Victorians who wrote the conduct books, the judges who cited Hale, the parliamentarians who debated the Matrimonial Causes Act while excluding the subject of marital violation entirely. They were not monsters. They were people shaped by the world they lived in. This is both more and less comfortable than the alternative. More comfortable because it means we do not have to imagine a conspiracy of deliberate cruelty. Less comfortable because it means that the same dynamic, of people in power operating in good faith within systems that harm others, can exist without anyone noticing it from inside. The people inside the system do not always see the shape of the system. That is part of how systems of harm maintain themselves. We can say that the women who fought for change were remarkable, not because they were somehow extraordinary, though some of them were, but because the conditions of their fight were so difficult, the cultural resistance so dense, the cost so high, and the progress so slow that continuing to fight required a particular combination of clarity and stubbornness and courage. They continued because they could see clearly what was wrong and were not willing to accept it as permanent. That is what advocacy looks like at the level of lived practice. It is not dramatic, it is patient, it is repetitive. It is the same argument made again and again in different rooms to different audiences until enough of them have heard it. Think for a moment about what it required of the women who made those arguments in the Victorian era. They lived in a world that was telling them, constantly and comprehensively, that their understanding of their own situation was less reliable than the interpretation others provided. The medical literature said so, the legal doctrine said so, the conduct book said so, the culture said so. To stand in that world and insist that you knew something true about your own experience, that the experience you were describing was real and significant and deserving of legal response, was not a small thing. It was a claim that had to be made against enormous resistance. We can say that the Victorian woman in the cold bedroom was not alone in her experience, even though she was alone in her room. She was connected to millions of women across time who had the same experience in different rooms, in different decades, in different countries. She was connected forward to the women who would campaign on her behalf without knowing her, who would stand in courtrooms and speak to parliaments, and write the books, and develop the legal arguments that would eventually, in 1991, produce the judgment that gave her experience a legal name. She could not know about those connections. She could not know that she was part of a history. She was just there, in her present, with what was available. But we can know. That is the particular privilege and responsibility of looking back. We can see the connections she could not see. We can follow the thread from her room to the 1991 courtroom. We can acknowledge the continuity, the long, unbroken continuity of women's experience and women's resistance that runs through all of it. Let us think for a moment about what this continuity means. It means that the Victorian woman lying still in the cold bedroom and the woman in 1991 who said no and whose case went to the House of Lords were not separated by a gap of neutral history. They were separated by a chain of women who had tried, in various ways and with various degrees of success, to change what was happening. The chain was imperfect. Many of the links broke or bent. Many of the women who worked on the problem spent their lives on it without seeing meaningful change, but the chain connected them. The effort passed from hand to hand across the generations. This is what social change actually looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic moment of collective realization, not a sudden turning point. A chain, a patient, sometimes invisible, often discouraging chain of effort that runs from the first woman who articulated the problem clearly enough for another woman to understand it, through all the women who tried to do something about it, to the moment when enough had accumulated that the law could no longer hold its position. And we can notice that what she was experiencing was not a private matter. That is the final thing we can say, and perhaps the most important one. The legal doctrine that governed her bedroom was not an accidental feature of a legal system that otherwise treated women fairly. It was part of a comprehensive structure that had been deliberately built, over centuries, through judicial decisions and parliamentary choices and cultural assumptions, to manage women's existence in ways that served male interests. The bedroom was not the most visible part of that structure, but it was among the most intimate, and what happens to people in the most intimate reaches of their lives is not separate from what happens in the world. The Victorian woman knew this, even without the political language to say it. She felt the connection between the legal structures that erased her property rights and the legal structures that declared her consent irrevocable. She felt it in her bones, in the way that people always feel injustice at the level of the body before they have the language to name it. The personal was always political. It just took until the 1970s for that formulation to be articulated clearly enough that it became a way of seeing. It is very late. The fire is entirely out. The room is dark in the particular way that rooms are dark when all sources of light have been consumed. Not frightening dark, just complete dark. The darkness that asks nothing of you. She's still there, lying very still, breathing with the particular evenness of someone who has learned that evenness is the safest breath to take. She does not know that she is being thought of. She does not know that her existence, the particular texture of her experience, the cold room, the folded hands, the silence, is being carried forward by people she will never meet into a world she cannot imagine. But we are thinking of her, and we will carry it forward, and that is not nothing. In the long account of history, in the long argument about what the world owes to the people it has harmed, the act of acknowledgement is not nothing. She is part of the story, she has always been part of the story, and the story is not over. The cold is the same cold, the dark is the same dark, the silence is the same silence. But we are here now, in this late hour, and we have sat with what was real, and we have not looked away. That is all we can do from this distance. It turns out to be something. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The night has reached its deepest point now. The hour before the world begins to turn back toward morning. Let it be quiet. The Victorian woman is still in her room. The cold is still there. But we have sat with it for a while now, and the sitting has been its own kind of witnessing. We have acknowledged what was real. We have followed the thread forward, through all the years and all the women and all the arguments, to the place where the law finally said what needed to be said. Let that be enough for tonight. The candle is out now. The room is dark in the particular way that rooms are dark when all sources of light have been consumed. Not frightening dark, just complete dark. The darkness that asks nothing of you. Let your breath slow. The women of the Victorian era are very far away. The legal battles of the 19th and 20th centuries are settled into history. The cold bedroom is a cold bedroom that will warm with morning. Everything that needed to happen tonight has happened. There is nothing more to carry, let it rest. The city outside is entirely still. The streets that were busy with carriages and carts and the ordinary traffic of Victorian life are quiet now, as all streets are quiet at this hour. The gas lamps have burned down. The buildings are dark. You are somewhere comfortable. You are warm. The night is doing what the night does, passing slowly toward morning as all nights do. Let your thoughts go where they want to go. Let them drift and circle and settle where they will. The story is over for tonight. The women in it are resting. The fire is cold, the candle is out. The room is dark and quiet, and the night is doing its long, patient work of carrying us from one day to the next. Let it carry you. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. What aspect of Victorian women's history would you like to explore next?